He rejected her in front of the entire pack, and she accepted it without shedding a single tear. But what the Alpha King didn't know was that the quiet maid he had just cast aside carried a bloodline powerful enough to strip the crown from everything he had built. And the bond between them was far older and far more dangerous than either of them understood. Someone in that hall knew the truth. Someone had always known. And they had spent 14 years making sure this moment would destroy her before she ever discovered what she really was. 30 days before the last declaration that would change both their lives forever, a gray-dressed girl with no name worth mentioning walked into the Alpha King's chamber and didn't bow. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't start in that hall. It starts 6 years earlier in the gray, rain-soaked streets of Govan, on the south bank of the River Clyde, where a 17-year-old girl with a worn canvas bag and absolutely nothing left to lose walked through the iron gates of Blackthorn Hall and changed everything, without ever meaning to. Her name was Jody Williamson, and she was, by every measurable standard, nobody. She had no bloodline worth mentioning, no pack affiliation, no wolf blood in her veins, or so everyone assumed. Her mother had died of a winter illness when Jody was 16, leaving her a 2-room flat in Govan, a stack of unpaid bills, and a letter of recommendation from a retired housekeeper named Mrs. Calloway, who had worked Blackthorn Hall for 30 years and who had looked at young Jody Williamson across a scratched kitchen table and said, plainly and without sentiment, "You're the kind of quiet that survives. Go to Blackthorn. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions." Jody had followed every instruction. She kept her auburn hair pinned back. She wore gray every single day. It was the color of invisibility in a place like Blackthorn. She learned the schedules, the preferences, the moods of every lord and lady who passed through those halls. She learned which doors creaked and which were silent. She learned how to be present without being seen, how to anticipate without being asked, how to exist in the spaces between powerful people without ever becoming a factor in their calculations. For 6 years, it worked perfectly. Then, on a Tuesday in late November, everything changed. The summons had come from head housekeeper Griselda, a sharp-eyed woman who communicated primarily through a combination of terse notes and withering glances. The note read simply, "Documents to the King's Chamber, 3rd floor. Do not linger." Jody had taken the tray, a neat stack of correspondence bound in leather cord, and climbed the east staircase, the one that servants used, the one that ran along the cold exterior wall where the stone breathed frost even in November. She had stood outside the heavy oak door of the Alpha King's chamber, knocked twice as instructed, and received silence in return. She had let herself in. The room was enormous and spare, the room of a man who did not believe in comfort as a concept. A single fire burned in the grate. Maps covered the main table in overlapping layers, weighted down by daggers. The air smelled of pine and iron and something wilder underneath, something she couldn't name, something that made the small hairs on her arms stand up in a way that had nothing to do with cold. And there, at the window, stood Callum Fraser. She had known his name, of course. Everyone in Glasgow knew his name. Alpha King of the Northern Packs, ruler of 17 territories stretching from the Highlands to the border. The man who had ended the clan wars at 26 by standing alone in a field and refusing to move. He had been described to her as cold, unapproachable, and terrifyingly competent. What she had not been told, what no description had prepared her for, was the way he looked standing at a window in the gray November light, staring out at the river with an expression that had nothing to do with power. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had simply, in this one unobserved moment, allowed themselves to look tired. She set the tray down on the side table, quietly, without disrupting him. She turned to leave. "You don't bow." His voice was low, not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that rooms reorganize themselves around. Jody stopped, turned slowly. "I beg your pardon, my lord?" He hadn't moved from the window, hadn't turned. "Every person who enters this room bows before they leave. You didn't." She felt the heat of a mistake, but under it, something else. Something that pushed back against the apology already forming on her tongue. "I apologize. I wasn't aware of the—" "I'm not asking for an apology." Now he turned, and his eyes found hers, dark, still, assessing. But something moved in them when they landed on her face, something quick and involuntary, like a flinch that wasn't a flinch. "I'm simply noting it." She looked at him for a moment, 1 second longer than was appropriate, 1 second longer than 6 years of training should have permitted. And then she left, without bowing. She did not know why. She would wonder about it for weeks afterward. That 1 second too long, that failure to bow. It was as though some part of her, some deep and stubborn and ancient part, had simply refused. In the wolf world, they had a word for that refusal. She didn't know it yet. Over the weeks that followed, Callum began requesting her specifically. It was always framed through Griselda, a note, a task, something small and defensible. Correspondence to be delivered. His chamber to be arranged before a visiting delegation. A tray at an unusual hour. Jody told herself it was nothing, that she was efficient and unobtrusive, and that efficiency was simply being recognized. She was good at her job, that was all. But the tasks required her to be in the room with him. And in the room with him, things happened that she could not file under efficiency. He asked her once where she was from. She said Govan. He said nothing for a moment, then, "The South Bank." Not a question, as though he was placing something in a map in his mind. She said yes. He nodded. And somehow that exchange, 7 words total, felt more intimate than any conversation she had witnessed in 6 years of Blackthorn Hall. He asked her, another time, whether she had any family. She said no. He said, "Neither do I." And then he had caught himself, and the brief openness in his face had shuttered closed, and he'd looked back at his maps, and she had finished arranging his desk and left without another word. She made him laugh on a Wednesday in December. It was an accident. She had knocked over a stack of territorial documents trying to reach a candlestick, and the whole carefully ordered map of the northern packs had cascaded to the floor in a flutter of parchment. And she had stood there for a moment with the candlestick in her hand, surrounded by chaos, and she had said, flatly, "I've rearranged your territories. You're welcome." He had laughed. A real laugh, sudden and low and surprised out of him, like something he'd forgotten he was capable of. It lasted only a second before he controlled it back into composure, but she had heard it. She felt it land in her chest like a coal dropped from the fire, warm and dangerous and impossible to ignore. That was when she understood that she was in serious trouble. The wolves knew before she did. It started subtly. Pack members who served within Blackthorn, guards, kitchen staff, the lower-ranked wolves who handled maintenance and grounds, began behaving strangely around her. Guards who had never once made eye contact began nodding when she passed. Two of Callum's personal guard wolves, massive men who communicated primarily by standing in doorways looking threatening, had actually stepped aside for her one morning in the corridor, not because she had asked, but because they had simply moved, automatically, instinctively, as though something in them recognized something in her. She noticed it. She didn't understand it. What she did understand, with escalating, stomach-turning clarity, was the way Queen Isolde had begun to look at her. Isolde of the Western clans was not a woman who broadcast her feelings. She had been bred, since childhood, for political composure. Her expressions were measured instruments, deployed with purpose. But over the course of December, a new expression had entered Isolde's repertoire when her frost-colored eyes fell on Jody Williamson. It was thin and cold and surgical, the expression of a woman who had identified a problem and was already calculating its removal. Jody tried to make herself smaller, quieter, more invisible. It didn't work. You cannot hide from someone who has already decided to find you. The summons came on the 22nd of December, 3 days before the winter solstice ceremony that was to formally seal the union between Callum and Isolde before the assembled clans. It was Griselda who delivered it, face carefully blank. "You are required in the Great Hall, now, as you are." As she was, gray dress, white apron, hair pinned. No preparation, no warning, no explanation. Jody walked down the main staircase into a hall full of wolves. They were all there. Every lord of every northern territory, every Western clan emissary, every guard, every senior pack member, every person of consequence within 100 miles of Glasgow. They lined the walls in their armor and their finery, and every single pair of eyes in the room turned to her as she entered. At the far end of the hall, beneath the twin banners of the Golden Lion, stood two people. Callum Fraser, in full armor, hands clasped behind his back, face like carved stone. And Isolde, in crimson, with her crown and her frost eyes and her composed, waiting smile. Jody stopped in the center of the hall. She stood in a room full of wolves who could tear her apart without breaking a sweat. And she stood there, alone and small and gray. And she kept her chin level and her hands still, and she looked at no one. Isolde's voice carried beautifully. It always did. "The Maid will confirm, before this court, that she has made no claim, implied or otherwise, upon the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, and that she accepts the natural order of her station." Jody's eyes moved, finally, to Callum. He was looking at her, and in his face she saw something that should not have been there, something that looked unmistakably like an apology. He had known this was coming. He had allowed it to be arranged. And now he was standing in his armor in front of his entire court, and he was looking at her like a man who had made a choice he already understood was wrong. She watched him draw a breath. She watched him gather himself, and she watched him say, in a voice that rang off every stone wall in Blackthorn Hall, "I reject." 2 words, the formal declaration of the Wolf Bond severance, ancient, irreversible, and devastating. The hall exhaled as one, 100 wolves releasing tension they had collectively held. Isolde's smile completed itself, and Jody Williamson, who had survived her mother's death and 6 years of invisibility and the particular cruelty of being seen by someone who should not have seen her, raised her head, found Callum's eyes, held them for exactly 1 second with those steady, gray, undefeated eyes, and said, quietly, in a voice that somehow carried to every corner of that silent hall, "I accept your rejection, my lord." She turned. She took 1 step toward the door, then another. The crowd parted before her, involuntarily, instinctively, every wolf stepping aside without knowing why, and she walked through the aisle they made for her with her back straight and her hands quiet and her face holding an expression that nobody in that hall would ever forget. Because it was not grief and it was not anger. It was dignity, the purest, most devastating kind. She was 4 steps from the door when it happened. A sound, low, reverberating, coming from somewhere that was not the throat of a man, but from something deeper, something older. A sound that made every wolf in the room snap to rigid attention, that made Isolde's smile vanish like smoke, that made the torches on the walls gutter and flare simultaneously, as though the air pressure in the room had changed. Jody stopped. She did not turn around. She did not need to, because every wolf in the hall had already turned, instinctively, toward the source of the sound, toward Callum Fraser, whose eyes were blazing gold, whose hands had closed into fists at his sides with a force that had left white crescents in his palms, whose composure, the legendary, iron, unbreachable composure of the Alpha King, had just shattered completely, publicly, and without any hope of reassembly. He had not moved, but something had broken open inside him, and the entire room could feel it, the way you feel a pressure change before a storm. In your bones, in your teeth, in the primitive animal part of your brain that knows, instinctively, that something enormous and unstoppable has just been set into motion. Isolde said, very carefully, "Callum." He didn't look at her. His gold eyes were fixed on the back of a gray-dressed maid who was 4 steps from the door. The most powerful wolf in Scotland took 1 step forward. And 100 wolves held their breath. What happens when a king breaks his own declaration? What happens when the most controlled man in the room becomes the most dangerous? And more importantly, why did Jody Williamson's calm, quiet acceptance destroy him when her tears never could have? Drop a comment below. Do you think Jody should have stayed, or was walking away the most powerful thing she ever did? Let me know before we go further, because what happens next changes everything. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a king's breaking. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of 100 people who have just witnessed something they were never supposed to see. Something that rewrites every assumption they carried into the room, and who now stand absolutely still because moving feels like it might make it more real. That was the silence that gripped the great hall of Blackthorn in the seconds after Callum Fraser's composure shattered. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The torches burned. The twin golden lions on their banners stared down at the frozen court with the blank authority of things that have witnessed centuries of human foolishness and stopped being surprised by it. Jody had stopped walking. She stood 4 steps from the door with her back to the room, and she could feel it. All of it, pressing against her spine like a physical force. The weight of 100 stairs. The pressure of that sound still reverberating in the stone walls. And underneath everything, that pull. That deep, insistent, infuriating pull that she had spent 3 months learning to ignore, and that was now pulling so hard she had to plant her feet deliberately to keep from turning around. She did not turn around. She had accepted his rejection. She had meant it. She had said the words, and she had chosen them carefully, and she had constructed, in the 3 seconds between hearing "I reject" and opening her mouth to respond, the entire architecture of her survival. And it was built on the foundation of walking through that door and not looking back. Her right foot moved forward. Jody. Her name, in his voice. Not the maid, not a command to halt, just her name. Her actual name, spoken by the Alpha King in front of his entire court, which he had no reason to know and no occasion to have used, and which therefore could only mean one thing. He had been saying it, privately, to himself, or in conversation with someone, or simply in his own mind. He had been saying her name, and it had come out in this moment with the ease of something well-worn, something handled often. The hall, impossibly, went even quieter. Jody closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second to feel the full weight of what that single word had just cost him, and what it would cost her if she turned around. 1 second of honest grief, private and invisible to everyone in the room. Then she opened her eyes, and she walked through the door. She made it to the east corridor before her legs decided they were done cooperating. She found the wall with one hand and stood there in the cold stone passageway, breathing carefully, listening to the muffled eruption of voices beginning in the great hall behind her. The immediate, urgent conference of a court that had just witnessed something unprecedented and was scrambling to process it. She could hear Isolde's voice cutting through the noise, controlled and sharp as a blade, beginning immediately to manage the narrative. That was Isolde's gift. That was what 14 years of political grooming produced. A woman who could absorb a catastrophe and begin spinning it into strategy before the dust settled. Jody pressed her back against the stone wall and stared at the vaulted ceiling above her, and told herself, firmly and clearly, that she was not going to fall apart in a servant's corridor. She had accepted the rejection. She had meant every word. She had no claim on Callum Fraser, had never had one, had never sought one, had only been guilty of the entirely involuntary crime of being seen by someone whose recognition of her had apparently bypassed every rational and political filter he possessed, and lodged itself somewhere deep and irremovable. She was a maid from Govan. He was the Alpha King. The story was always going to end here. She pushed off the wall. She straightened her apron. She pinned the single loose strand of auburn hair back into place with the mechanical precision of someone performing necessary maintenance on a structure that needed to stay standing. And she walked to the servants' stairs. because the hall would need clearing after court, because there was always work, because work was the one thing that had never abandoned her, and she intended to return the loyalty. She did not see Griselda standing at the top of the staircase until she was nearly upon her. The head housekeeper's face was difficult to read at the best of times. Tonight, it was doing something complicated. A mixture of expressions that seemed to be at war with each other. Professional composure wrestling with something that looked unexpectedly like concern. Genuine concern. The kind that had nothing to do with schedules or household management. "Your room," Griselda said, simply. Not an instruction, an order from someone who understood the situation with a depth that Jody suddenly suspected went beyond the obvious. "There's work, your room, Jody." And then Griselda did something she had done perhaps 3 times in 6 years. She used her name. "Everything else will wait." Jody's room was in the servants' wing on the ground floor, a small rectangle of stone with a single window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. She had made it her own over 6 years in the small, deliberate ways that people with limited resources make spaces theirs. A piece of blue cloth over the windowsill. 3 books stacked on the shelf above the bed. A photograph of her mother tucked into the frame of the small mirror on the wall. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph for a long time. Her mother had been a quiet woman too, a woman who survived by being careful. Jody had always assumed she inherited that from her, the carefulness, the smallness, the particular talent for not being a problem. But her mother had also had secrets. Jody had understood that in the abstract, theoretical way that children understand things about their parents without yet having access to the details. There had been things her mother would not discuss. Questions that were deflected with the practiced ease of someone who had been deflecting them for years. A box that lived under the floorboard in the second room that Jody had been told firmly and once was not for her. She had never opened it. After her mother died, in the cold, miserable weeks of managing death and debt and the logistics of disappearing a life, she had found the box still there, still under the floorboard. She had picked it up. She had held it. She had put it in her canvas bag when she packed for Blackthorn. And she had carried it for 6 years. And she had never once opened it. She didn't entirely know why, except that opening it felt like releasing something she was not yet prepared to manage. She looked at the box now. It lived on the shelf beside the books, unremarkable, dark-stained wood, no lock. And she felt, for the first time since carrying it out of Govan, that it was looking back. She reached for it. The knock came before she could open it. 3 knocks, deliberate. Not a servant's knock. Servants knocked twice, quickly, apologetically. This was 3, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who was accustomed to doors being opened rather than answered. Jody put the box down. She stood. She straightened, and she opened the door. It was not Callum. It was Isolde, without her court, without guards, without the crimson cape or the composed public smile. She stood in the doorway of a maid's room in a plain traveling dress with her silver hair unadorned and her frost-colored eyes carrying something that Jody had never once seen in them in 3 months of careful observation. Fear. Not the thin, manageable kind, the real kind, the kind that lives in the body. Jody said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was its own form of power. that the person who spoke first in an uncomfortable moment was the person who had more to lose by the silence continuing. She stood in her doorway, and she waited. Isolde looked at her for a long moment, taking her in. And something moved across that porcelain face, something that might, on anyone else, have been called recognition. "May I come in?" Isolde said. And it was the asked that undid Jody's resistance. Not commanded, not assumed, asked. She stepped aside. Isolde sat in the single wooden chair. Jody remained standing. The room was very small with 2 people in it. The photograph of Jody's mother looked down from the mirror frame. Isolde's eyes found it, stayed on it, and the color in her face changed. "How long have you had that photograph?" she said. Jody looked at the photograph, at her mother's face, the auburn hair, the gray eyes, the same steady, quiet expression that people had apparently been attributing to Jody her whole life. "My whole life," she said. "It's my mother." Isolde made a sound, small and brief, and immediately controlled. But in the quiet of the small room, it was entirely audible. It was the sound of someone receiving a confirmation they had been dreading for a very long time. "Your mother's name," Isolde said. Her voice was careful, each word placed precisely. "Was it Moira?" The air in the room went strange. Jody stared at her. "How do you know my mother's name?" Isolde's frost eyes were wet. It was perhaps the most alarming thing Jody had ever seen. A queen with tears. A woman who had maintained flawless composure in every political arena for 14 years. Sitting in a maid's wooden chair with wet eyes and her hands folded tightly in her lap, like she was holding herself together by sheer structural effort. "Because Moira Williamson was my younger sister," Isolde said. "And that makes you my niece. And it means you are not a maid, Jody. You are the legitimate blood heir of the Western clans. And I have spent 14 years building a political alliance specifically designed to keep that fact buried." The room was silent. The photograph looked down. Jody sat, slowly, on the edge of her bed, because her legs had once again made their decision clear. "What?" she said. It was, she was aware, a deeply inadequate response to what had just been said, but it was honest. "Your mother ran," Isolde continued, and her voice had taken on the quality of something being read from a document, controlled, methodical. The delivery of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times and in many different versions, and had finally, irreversibly, arrived at the moment of delivering it. "She ran when you were 2 months old. She knew what you were, what the blood tests would show. She knew that the Western clans had laws about female blood heirs, and she knew what those laws meant for you. So she took you, and she ran to Glasgow, and she changed her name back to Williamson, our mother's name before marriage, and she hid in Govan, and she never told a single soul." Jody's mouth was dry. "She never told me. She was protecting you." "She was protecting me," Jody repeated. The words felt enormous in her mouth. "From what? From being Western clan royalty?" "From being a threat." Isolde looked at her steadily. "Female blood heirs of the Western clans carry something. An older power than pack designation, than alpha ranking, than any political alliance." She paused. They carry the ability to anchor a true mate bond. The real kind, not the arranged kind. The irrevocable kind that the ancient laws recognize above all other claims. Jody felt the blood leave her face. The recognition, she said, because she had heard that word. 3 months ago, in whispered conversations among the pack wolves, in the careful way Griselda had started watching her, in the particular quality of attention that every wolf in Blackthorn Hall had been paying to a gray-dressed maid for reasons none of them could articulate. Yes, Isolde said, the recognition, which, as I imagine you have now gathered, is not a legend. It is not folklore. It is biological and ancient, and completely outside the control of the parties involved. And Callum Fraser, her voice caught briefly on his name, has been in recognition with you since the moment you walked into his chamber. Since before that, possibly. Since the first time he was within range of your bloodline. Jody stared at her. And the rejection? Isolde's jaw tightened. Was my doing, entirely. I structured the scenario. I forced the public declaration. She stopped, composed herself. I told myself I was protecting the alliance, the peace between the northern and western territories. 17 years of negotiation, the welfare of thousands of pack members in both territories. I told myself the rejection was a political necessity and that the alternative, allowing a true mate bond to form between the Alpha King and a woman with a stronger legal claim to Western clan leadership than me, would destabilize everything. And now, Jody said. Isolde looked at her, and in those frost-colored eyes, the eyes that had been watching Jody with cold calculation for 3 months, was something rawer and more complicated than calculation. Grief, perhaps. The particular grief of someone who has been wrong for a very long time and has arrived, too late and at great cost, at the knowledge of it. Now, Isolde said, Callum has just violated the public rejection declaration by speaking your name in open court, which means the rejection is legally void, which means I have destroyed 14 years of political strategy, 2 alliances, and my own future for nothing, because you will have to be declared. She paused. The Western clans will have to be told what you are. And Callum Fraser will be told why he can't control himself around a maid, Jody said. And her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, because underneath everything, underneath the shock and the upended ground and the enormous restructuring revelation of her own identity, something else was happening. Something was clicking into place. 6 years of not understanding why she felt the way she felt in this building. Months of not understanding why a king kept finding reasons to be in the same room as a woman with calloused hands and a gray dress. A lifetime of not understanding why her mother had been so careful, so contained, so endlessly, exhaustingly vigilant about keeping them small and unseen. Now she understood. And understanding changed everything. He'll be told the truth, Isolde said. All of it. Tonight, if possible, before the court reconvenes. She stood, smoothed her dress. The Queen's composure was reassembling itself, piece by piece, over the ruined architecture of everything she had just confessed. Not completely, and not with the same solidity as before, but assembling nonetheless. Because Isolde was, whatever else she was, a woman who had survived by never allowing herself to stay down for long. She moved toward the door, stopped, turned back one final time to look at Jody, at her niece, sitting on the edge of a maid's bed in a servant's room, holding the weight of a rewritten identity with the same quiet, steady expression that had apparently been the hallmark of the Williamson women for at least 2 generations. "She loved you very much," Isolde said. "Your mother. She chose you over everything, over the clan, over her title, over me." A pause. "I was angry at her for a long time. I understand her better now." She left. The door closed quietly behind her. Jody sat in the silence for a long moment. Then she reached for the box on the shelf, the dark-stained wooden box she had carried for 6 years and never opened. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a fold of cloth, were 3 things. A ring, silver, engraved with the crest of the Western clans. A letter in her mother's handwriting, sealed and addressed simply, "For Jody, when it's time." And a small folded document, official in format, bearing 2 dates and 2 names and a set of seals that Jody now had enough context to recognize. A birth record. Her birth record. With her full name, written in a clerk's careful hand. Jody Moira Williamson Ashvale, legitimate blood heir, Western clans, first rank. She held it in her hands in the small room with the blue cloth on the windowsill and the photograph of her mother on the wall. And she felt the entire shape of her life reorganize itself around this one small piece of paper. She was not nobody. She had never been nobody. She had simply been hidden. And now, somewhere in the great halls above her, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs was standing in the wreckage of his own broken composure, surrounded by a frozen court with gold eyes that would not dim, because every wolf instinct he possessed was screaming the same thing it had been screaming for 3 months. "She's yours. She was always yours. And you just made the worst mistake of your reign." Outside the small window, the Glasgow night pressed dark and cold against the glass. And for the first time in 6 years, Jody Williamson did not feel like the most powerless person in Blackthorn Hall. She felt like the eye of a storm that was only just beginning. There is a difference between a man who loses his temper and a man who loses his foundation. A man who loses his temper makes noise. He shouts, he strikes things, he fills the room with the evidence of his feeling, and then, eventually, he burns through it and goes quiet, and the world reassembles around him. A man who loses his foundation does something far more dangerous. He goes completely still. That was what Callum Fraser did when Lord Brennan, his most senior advisor, a gray-bearded wolf of 60 who had served 3 Alpha Kings and claimed to have seen everything worth seeing in the political landscape of the Scottish Packs, finished telling him the truth about Jody Williamson. He had been standing at the window of his private study, the same window where he had first noticed her, where he had first heard that sound she made when she moved through a room. That particular quality of presence that was somehow both minimal and overwhelming, like a single cello note in a large, silent space. The fire was burning. The maps were on the table. Everything in the room was exactly as it always was. Callum stood at the window and listened to every word Lord Brennan said without interrupting, without moving, without any visible response whatsoever. And when Brennan finished, when the last word of the truth had been delivered with the careful precision of a man laying down something he knows is explosive, the Alpha King stood in complete stillness for 11 seconds. Brennan counted. He told people about it afterward, in the careful, lowered tones of someone recounting something they had witnessed but not fully processed. 11 seconds of absolute stillness, like watching a mountain decide what to do next. Then Callum said, in a voice of remarkable quietness, "How long have you known?" Brennan said, "2 weeks, my lord." Another silence, shorter this time. "And before me, who else knows?" Isolde has known since birth. Her inner council, 3, possibly 4 members, have known for some years. Griselda. A pause. Griselda has known since Jody arrived at Blackthorn. At the name Griselda, something moved in Callum's jaw. A tightening, brief and controlled. But Brennan had served 3 kings, and he knew how to read the small shifts in powerful men. That jaw movement was the equivalent, in Callum Fraser's emotional vocabulary, of someone else overturning a table. "Griselda," Callum said. "She was instructed, my lord, by Isolde through channels that, in fairness to Griselda, carried the full authority of the Western clan leadership. She was not acting independently. She was managing a situation she was ordered to manage." "She watched me," Callum said. And now the quietness in his voice had a texture. Not anger, not yet. Something that sat underneath anger, the way bedrock sits under soil. "For 3 months. She watched me walk into a recognition I had no information about. She watched the bond forming, and she said nothing." She was protecting the girl, my lord, in her own way, by keeping her close and within reach of what? Callum turned from the window, and Brennan took an involuntary step backward, not because Callum had raised his voice, because he hadn't, but because his eyes were still gold. They had been gold since the Great Hall. They had not dimmed. In 30 years of observing alpha wolves, Brennan had never seen an alpha's shift gold eyes sustain for this long without the shift occurring. It meant the wolf inside the man was in a state of sustained, unresolvable conflict. It meant the instinct and the decision were at war, and neither was winning. Of what, Brennan? Within reach of a king who was being manipulated into rejecting her? How was proximity protection? Brennan had no good answer for that. He offered the only honest one. "I don't know, my lord." Callum looked at him for a moment, then he looked away. "Get out." "My lord, please." The word came out rougher than the rest, like something that had been compressed and released slightly against his will. "Give me the room." Brennan gave him the room. Alone, Callum Fraser did not overturn tables. He did not strike walls. He did not make any of the sounds that the wolves outside his door were bracing themselves for, standing in the corridor with their shoulders tight and their ears primed, waiting for the evidence of his reaction. He sat down, in the chair by the fire, the chair that was not his usual working chair, that was behind the desk, behind the maps, behind the authority of function. This was the chair by the fire, the chair that was just a chair, and he sat in it like a man who has had the ground removed from under him and is trying to determine whether he can stand on whatever is left. He thought about the first time he had seen her, not the window moment, before that. He had known she was in the building before he saw her. He had known it the way you know a change in weather before it arrives, in the body, in the pressure of the air, in some sense that doesn't have a name in human language, but that every wolf understands as bone deep and irrefutable. He had ignored it for 2 weeks. He had told himself it was the stress of the summit, the proximity of a political arrangement he had never wanted, the general weight of 17 territories pressing on him in a building that wasn't his. Then she had walked into his chamber with a tray of documents, and the thing he had been ignoring had become impossible to ignore. And he had done the only thing available to him in that moment. He had noted that she didn't bow, because he couldn't say what he'd actually wanted to say, which was, "There you are. I've been trying not to know where you are for 2 weeks." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. 3 months. He had spent 3 months constructing elaborate justifications for spending time in the same room as a hall maid. 3 months of telling himself that the requests were reasonable, the tasks legitimate, the interest professional. 3 months of lying to himself with increasing desperation, while every wolf instinct he possessed screamed that he was in recognition with a woman he had no political right to claim. And then Isolde had arranged the court spectacle, and he had stood there in front of his entire kingdom, and he had looked at Jody Williamson, and he had made a calculation that he was now going to have to live with for the rest of his life. He had chosen the alliance. He had chosen the politics. He had chosen 17 territories and the peace between them, over a truth his own body had been telling him for months. And she had accepted it. That was the thing he could not stop returning to. That was the thing that had cracked him open in front of his court with a thoroughness that no battlefield had ever managed. She had accepted it with more dignity than he had shown in making it. He had called her name. He hadn't planned to. It had come out of him like something wrenched loose. Her name, her actual name that he had been saying privately, and apparently more often than was wise, had simply escaped every filter he possessed in the moment she turned away. Because something in him had understood, in that fraction of a second, that if she walked through that door, having accepted a rejection that was politically constructed and personally dishonest, he would spend the rest of his life in a particular kind of silence that had nothing to do with choice. She hadn't stopped. She had walked through the door anyway, which meant she had more discipline than he did, more integrity, more genuine acceptance of reality than the alpha king of the northern packs, who was currently sitting by a fire with gold eyes and dismantled foundations, comprehensively undone by a woman who made his laugh come back to him after years without it, and who had called the overturning of his territorial documents a rearrangement he was welcome for. He almost smiled at that, then didn't, because she had done that for him, had given him that, the small, private warmth of it, and he had stood in his great hall and publicly severed it for political convenience. There was a word for that. He was applying it to himself with some thoroughness. A knock. 3, evenly spaced. His knock, the knock he used, that his court had adopted, the one that meant this is someone with authority, and this is not a negotiable interruption. He knew, before the door opened, who it was. "Come in, Isolde," he said. She entered without her court, without her cape, without the composed public face, or rather, with a version of it that was functioning at reduced capacity, like armor that had taken significant damage and was still being worn out of necessity rather than full confidence. She looked at his eyes, the gold. She had been expecting it, had known from the moment the declaration broke in the great hall that this was coming. But seeing it still cost her something. "You came to confess or to manage," he said. His voice was even. He had rebuilt, in the time alone, a surface of composure. It was not his best work, but it would hold for a conversation. "Both," she said, which was, he noted, the most honest thing she had said to him in 14 years. "Then confess first." She sat, not in the supplicant's chair, not in a position of strategic submission. She sat across from him like an equal, which was her right by rank, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she told him everything, from the beginning. From Moira Williamson running with an infant and a ring and a birth record, to Isolde inheriting a clan leadership that was never fully hers to inherit, to 14 years of building an alliance specifically designed to secure a future that the existence of Jody Williamson, if known, would have legally dismantled. She told him about the box, about Griselda's instructions, about the Western clan laws regarding female blood heirs and true mate anchoring, and what it would have meant, politically, legally, dynastically, if the recognition had been allowed to run its course without intervention. She did not minimize. She did not deflect. She spoke clearly and completely, the way someone speaks when they have decided that the time for strategy has passed and there is nothing left to do but tell the truth and absorb whatever it costs. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The rejection is void." "Yes." "Because I spoke her name." "Yes. Under Western clan law, and Northern Pack law concurs on this specific point, a verbal rejection that is subsequently countered by a recognition call from the rejecting party within the same proceeding is considered legally incomplete. The bond was never formally severed. He absorbed this. "And the alliance?" Isolde's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Is built on a false premise. I cannot maintain a claim to Western clan leadership while a legitimate blood heir is alive and in recognition with the Northern Alpha. The law is unambiguous." She paused. "I knew this. I have always known this. I built the entire arrangement on the calculation that you would never find out because Moira was gone and Jody was hidden, and the box was never going to be opened." "Jody opened it." "Tonight, after I told her." A pause. "I went to her room, Callum. I told her myself. I couldn't let her find out through a court proceeding or a legal declaration. She deserved to hear it from a person." He looked at her for a moment, at this woman he had been pledged to since birth, whom he had never loved, and whom he had spent 14 years respecting and carefully maintaining a productive political distance from. And he found, to his own surprise, something other than anger. Not forgiveness. That was a longer road than one conversation could travel. But something in the vicinity of understanding. The understanding of someone who had also, in his own way, made choices driven by duty and politics and the weight of other people's welfare, rather than by anything resembling his own truth. "You spent 14 years," he said, "building a future on a foundation you knew was unsound." "Yes, so did I," he said. The fire cracked. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "What happens now?" Isolde said. "Now," Callum said, and he stood, because he had been sitting long enough, had been still long enough, had been absorbing things long enough, and now his body was telling him with considerable urgency that there was somewhere he needed to be. "I go and speak to Jody Williamson." "She may not want to see you," Isolde said. And it was not a warning, not a manipulation. It was simply, honestly, accurate. "I know," he said. "I'm going anyway." He reached for his armor's fur-lined cloak, stopped, put it back. He had been wearing armor since he arrived in this building. Not always literal armor. Tonight, he was going to a maid's room in the servants' wing, and he was going without the cloak, and without the political architecture, and without any title or leverage whatsoever. He was going as a man who had made a serious mistake, and who understood that the first step in addressing it was to stand in front of the person he had wronged and say so. "The court will want a statement by morning," Brennan had said. There would be a statement. There would be a declaration. There would be the legal unraveling of a 14-year political arrangement and the reconstruction of two territorial alliances on more honest ground. All of it complicated, all of it consequential, all of it genuinely important for the welfare of thousands of PAC members in both territories. All of that was true, and all of it could wait until morning. He walked the east corridor, the servants' passage. He had never walked it before. It was cold and narrow and ran along the exterior wall, the path that Jody had been walking twice a day for 6 years, that she had walked tonight on her way back from the worst moment of her life. He found the servants' wing, found the door with the blue cloth visible through the small gap at the floor, a visible detail that he had no particular reason to know about, except that he had apparently noticed everything about this woman without conscious effort since the moment she arrived in his building. He knocked. 3, evenly spaced. A pause, longer than necessary for someone simply crossing a small room to a door. She would be weighing it, knowing from the knock who it was, deciding. He waited. The door opened. Jody Williamson stood in the doorway of her small room with her hair down. He had never seen her hair down before. It was longer than he'd realized, and seeing it sent something through him that he concentrated carefully on managing. And in her hands was a piece of paper that he could see, even from the doorway, was a birth record. She looked at him. Her gray eyes, steady, clear, the eyes of someone who had just had their entire identity rewritten and was still, somehow, standing, moved from his face to the paper in her hands and back to his face. "How much do you know?" she said. "Everything," he said, "as of about 20 minutes ago. I'm sorry it took 20 minutes. It should have taken 3 months less than that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He stepped inside. He looked at the small room, the books, the blue cloth, the photograph, and he felt something in his chest that was composed equally of shame and tenderness, and a furious retrospective grief for every conversation they had not had, and every truth he had not pursued with the diligence it deserved. He looked at her mother's photograph. "She looks like you," he said. "I look like her," Jody said. And the distinction, small and precise, was so entirely her, so perfectly the way she adjusted things, quietly and without performance, that he felt it like something physical. He turned to face her. She was standing by the bed with the birth record in her hands, and she looked, not small, not the way she had always managed to look small in the great halls, not the willful invisibility she had constructed over 6 years, but entirely herself. In the unguarded space of her own room, with the truth finally out in the open, she looked like the full size of who she actually was. And it was considerable. "I came to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. He had prepared nothing. He had walked the cold servants' corridor without a single prepared sentence, because he had understood, instinctively, that prepared sentences were another form of armor, and he had left his armor in the study tonight. So he said the true thing, the plainest, most irreducible version of it. "I chose wrong," he said. "I stood in that hall with full knowledge of what I was doing, and I chose the political outcome over the honest one. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I told myself the alliance justified it. It didn't. Nothing justifies standing in front of someone who trusts you, who has given you the specific, rare, costly kind of trust that is given by a person who has learned not to trust, and using that trust to perform a public cruelty for political convenience." She was listening. Her face was not forgiving him. It was too soon for forgiveness, and she was too honest for premature generosity. But she was listening with the full quality of attention that was, he had learned, one of her most disarming characteristics. She gave her entire attention when she listened. It was like standing in direct sunlight. "I'm not asking you to forget it," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen or to absorb it graciously because circumstances have changed. I'm asking you to hear me when I say that I know what I did. And I know what it cost you. And I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making sure that the answer to what comes next is one that you choose, not one that is arranged or declared or handed down from a court." The room was quiet. Outside the small window, Glasgow was dark and cold and indifferent. Jody looked at the birth record in her hands for a moment. Then she set it on the bed beside her and crossed her arms. Not defensively, the way people cross their arms when they're protecting themselves, but with the contained, particular posture of someone who is thinking carefully and wants their body to reflect that. "You know what the law says," she said, "about the recognition, about what I am." "Yes." "And you're aware that none of that is something I chose or asked for?" "Yes." "Then you understand," she said, "that whatever comes next has to start from what I actually want. Not from what the law says I'm entitled to. Not from what Isolde's conscience requires. Not from what is politically expedient for the northern packs." She looked at him directly. "From what I want." "Yes," he said, and meant it with a completeness that surprised even him. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the wind off the Clyde pressed cold against the small window. The photograph of her mother looked down from the mirror frame. The fire in the small grate burned low. "Then you can start," Jody Williamson said, "by sitting down. Because I have questions, and I expect honest answers. And this is going to take a while." He sat down, and for the first time since he had stood in the great hall and made the worst decision of his reign, the gold in his eyes began, very slowly, to settle. Morning came to Glasgow the way it often did in December. reluctantly, gray, and without any particular apology for the darkness it was replacing. By the time the first pale light was pressing itself against the narrow windows of Blackthorn Hall, the building had already been awake for hours. Not with the ordinary wakefulness of a household preparing for its day, not the sound of fires being laid and kettles being set, and the measured, rhythmic machinery of domestic routine. This was a different kind of wakefulness, tighter, the kind that moves through walls and under doors and settles into the bodies of everyone it reaches, making them alert in the way that animals are alert before a storm they can smell but not yet see. The court was assembled in the great hall by 6, not because anyone had been summoned, because nobody could stay in their chambers, because the previous night had left 17 territorial lords, 42 clan emissaries, and approximately 60 pack warriors in a state of unresolved tension that the human body simply cannot maintain in a horizontal position, and so they had risen, one by one, and gravitated toward the great hall in the gray pre-dawn the way water gravitates toward the lowest point. Instinctively, inevitably, following the pull of something unfinished. They stood in clusters, armored men in quiet, urgent conversations, emissaries in pairs, exchanging words beneath their breath with the careful, minimal movement of people who understand they are being observed. The fires had been lit, great hearths at both ends of the hall, burning high and amber, throwing long shadows up the stone walls where the twin golden lions stared down with their usual sovereign indifference. And in the center of all of it, standing apart from every group with the particular isolation of someone whose position has just been comprehensively redefined, was Lord Aldrich Vane. He was 64 years old, Lord of the Eastmoor Territory, the second largest northern holding after the king's own. He had silver-streaked hair, a soldier's build that age had thickened but not diminished, and the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years making political calculations that prioritized his own territorial interests above almost everything else, and who had, in that time, been successful enough at it to develop a deep and genuine conviction that his judgment was superior to most. He had spent the night calculating. What he had arrived at, by dawn, was this. Jody Williamson, whatever she was and whoever she turned out to be, represented the single most destabilizing force to enter the Northern Pac political landscape in a generation. A legitimate Western clan heir, one with a stronger legal claim to Western leadership than Isolde, one who was in true mate recognition with the Alpha King, was not a complication. She was a restructuring. She was the complete redrawing of every territorial agreement, every succession arrangement, every power balance that had been carefully negotiated and maintained over 14 years. Lord Aldrich Vane did not want restructuring. He wanted the map to stay where it was. His lands were positioned well on the current map, so he had made a decision. And at 5:47 in the morning, while Callum Fraser was still in the servants' wing of Blackthorn Hall, sitting across from a maid with a birth record in her hands and answering questions with the painstaking honesty of a man on a very particular kind of probation, Lord Vane had sent 4 of his personal guard wolves to the servants' quarters with a written removal order bearing his territorial seal. The order cited a provision in the Northern Pac Guest Charter, a rarely invoked clause that allowed senior territorial lords to request the removal of non-Pac civilians from Pac sovereign premises during active political summits, on the grounds of security. It was technically legal. It had been used twice in the last 100 years, both times in circumstances completely unlike the present one, and both times unsuccessfully. But it was on the books, and Vane had found it at 3 a.m. with the focused energy of a man who has decided on an outcome and is working backward to find its justification. His 4 guards reached the servants' wing at 5:52. They did not reach Jody's room. They reached Griselda. What happened next was described differently by the 4 guards in their subsequent accounts, but the common elements were these. Griselda had been standing in the corridor outside Jody's room since approximately 4 a.m. She had a candle. She had her keys, the enormous iron ring of keys that every head housekeeper at Blackthorn had carried for 300 years. The keys to every room and every store and every passage in the building. And she had an expression that the 4 guards, independently and without consulting each other, all described as deeply unencouraging. She had read Vane's removal order. She had read it with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had been managing the affairs of powerful people for 30 years, and who had learned, in that time, that the most dangerous thing you could do when presented with paperwork designed to pressure you into quick compliance was to read it slowly. Then she had folded it, and she had handed it back to the lead guard. And she had said, with the calm of someone describing the weather, "This corridor is restricted household staff access only during active summit proceedings. That is in the building charter, Section 4, Paragraph 9. You are not household staff. You are Lord Vane's personal retinue, which classifies you as visiting security under Section 7. You have no access rights to this corridor without the Alpha King's personal authorization." A pause. Do you have the Alpha King's personal authorization? They did not. They stood in the corridor for 11 minutes, attempting to reach Lord Vane for further instructions. During those 11 minutes, Griselda stood in front of the door to Jody's room with her candle and her keys, and the particular immovable quality of a woman who has decided that this is the hill, and she is prepared to be the entirety of the battle that happens on it. By the time Vane's furious response arrived, "Obtain the authorization. Wake the duty officer. Do it immediately." It was 6:15. The court was assembling in the Great Hall, and Callum Fraser, who had been informed of the removal attempt by the single Pat guard he had stationed quietly outside the servants' wing at 2 a.m, as a precaution born of instinct and 3 months of learning to pay attention, was already moving. He came through the Great Hall's main doors at 6:22. Not from the King's entrance, the formal approach, the raised dais entrance that required the herald's announcement and the court's formal reception. The main doors. The doors that anyone could walk through. He came through them alone, without ceremony, without his outer cloak, in the armor he had been wearing for 2 days because he had not slept, and he walked into the assembled court with the particular quality of forward momentum that made people clear a path not because they had been told to, but because every instinct they possessed told them to. He walked to the center of the hall. He stopped. He looked at Lord Aldrich Vane across the crowd. And Lord Vane, to his credit, did not look away. He was not a coward, whatever else he was. And the 2 men held each other's gaze in the silence of the assembled court, with the quality of a conversation that needed no words because its content was already fully understood by everyone in the room. Then Callum said, in the carrying, even voice that rooms organize themselves around, "Lord Vane, the removal order you issued at 5:47 this morning has been rescinded. The person it was issued against is under the personal protection of the Alpha King of the Northern Pax. Any future attempt to remove, restrict, or in any way act against that person without my explicit authorization will be treated as a direct challenge to my authority, with the full consequences that classification carries. A pause. Is that clear? Lord Vane said, My lord, the political implications of what you appear to be is that clear, Callum said again. The same voice, the same even, unraised, completely unambiguous tone. A long pause. The court did not breathe. Clear, Lord Vane said. Good, Callum said. And then he did something that the assembled court was entirely unprepared for. He turned and looked toward the hall's main entrance, the doors he had come through, with the expression of someone who is waiting for something specific. The court followed his gaze. The doors opened. She wore gray. Not because she had been told to, not because she lacked options. Isolde had sent clothes to the servants' wing at dawn, an act of reparation that Jody had looked at for a long time before making her decision. She wore gray because it was her color, because she had worn it for 6 years in this building, and it was honest and it was hers. And she had decided, somewhere between midnight and dawn, in a small room with a birth record and a man answering questions across from her, that she was not going to walk into this hall wearing borrowed identity. She came in with her hair pinned, with her hands quiet at her sides, with her chin level and her gray eyes open, and her face carrying an expression that the court would spend considerable time discussing in the hours and days afterward. Because it was not triumph, and it was not nerves, and it was not the careful, constructed composure of someone performing bravery. It was simply the expression of someone who has stopped pretending to be smaller than they are and is walking, for the first time, at their full size. Griselda walked 2 steps behind her. The court parted. Every wolf in the room stepping aside. The same thing that had happened the previous night, that involuntary, instinct-driven clearing of a path, but louder now, more visible, happening with the full consciousness of a court that now understood what it meant. The recognition responding to her bloodline and her bond, every wolf in the room acknowledging, in the oldest language their nature possessed, what she was. She walked to the center of the hall. She stopped beside Callum. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the court, at the 100 faces turned toward her, at the lords and emissaries and warriors who had watched her walk out of this room the previous night as a maid accepting a rejection, and who were now watching her walk back into it as something else entirely. She let herself be seen. She did not perform the seeing. She simply allowed it, the way you allow weather. Then she looked at Callum. He was looking at her with an expression that he was not, this morning, making any effort to contain. It was the expression she had seen once, briefly, at his window. The expression underneath the authority, the one that had no tactical purpose whatsoever, and was therefore the most honest thing about him. It was the expression of someone who had very nearly lost something and was standing in the specific, acute awareness of that near loss. And it was not a small thing to have turned toward you in a room full of people. She held it for a moment. Then she looked back at the court. It was Isolde who moved first. She came from the eastern side of the hall, where she had been standing apart from the Western clan emissaries, with the particular isolation of someone whose position is in the process of fundamental change. She was in crimson, her last day in crimson, though no one knew that yet, and she walked to the center of the hall with the measured grace of someone who has made a decision at great cost and has committed to it completely. She stopped in front of Jody. The court went absolutely silent. Isolde of the Western clans looked at her niece, at Moira's daughter. Moira's gray eyes and auburn hair and quiet hands. And she did something that no political calculation had prepared anyone in that room to witness. She inclined her head. Not the political head inclination of equal to equal, the deeper one, the one that acknowledged precedence. A sound moved through the court, not words, not exclamations. I will have those conversations without the Alpha King present, without Western clan emissaries present, with nothing but a recorder and whatever amount of time each lord requires. I will do that because the well-being of the pack members in those territories is not a political talking point to me. It is the actual point. She looked at Vane directly. Does that address your concern about stability? Or would you like to tell the court what your concern actually is? Silence. Lord Vane said nothing. From somewhere in the assembled court, one of the younger pack lords, a man in his 30s named Ferris, who held a modest eastern territory and who had been watching the proceedings with wide, attentive eyes, made a sound. Brief, not a word, the kind of sound that means yes in the language of rooms. Others followed. Not applause, this was not that kind of court, but a shift. An audible, physical shift in the atmosphere of the hall. 60 wolves simultaneously adjusting their orientation the way a flock adjusts mid-flight, following something they couldn't have named but recognized instinctively. Lord Vane sat down. The formal recognition took 40 minutes. Jody Williamson Ashvale, she kept both names, Williamson because it was her mother's and she would not put it aside, Ashvale because it was her right and she was done declining things that were hers, was formally recognized as Western clan blood heir before the full assembled court of the Northern Pack Summit. Isolde formally stepped aside from the Western clan's succession, retaining her role as senior diplomatic counsel, a position that suited her considerable political intelligence without requiring a claim she had held on false ground. She accepted it with the grace of someone who had made peace with a reckoning and was prepared to do the work of what came after. The alliance framework was not dissolved. It was restructured. The first meeting scheduled for the following week, with Jody's proposed individual consultations beginning the week after. The political machinery began the slow, complicated process of reshaping itself around a new reality, the way water reshapes around a new stone. And through all of it, Callum Fraser stood beside Jody Williamson in the great hall of Blackthorn and said almost nothing, because she did not need him to speak for her, and he understood that. And his understanding of it was perhaps the most significant thing he had demonstrated all morning. He was there. He was entirely, unambiguously there. But he was there as a presence beside her rather than a structure around her. The distinction was not small. When the formal proceedings closed and the court began to disperse into the urgent, buzzing work of a political landscape in reconfiguration, he leaned slightly toward her, not conspicuously, not with performance, and said, quietly, for her alone, "How are you doing?" She considered this with genuine attention, the way she considered everything. Then she said, "I'm not entirely sure. Ask me again in an hour." He almost smiled. In an hour. She looked at him sideways, and something moved in her face. Not fully formed, not yet, too early and too complicated for full formation, but present. A beginning of something. The first morning light of something that had been building in the dark for months, and was now, carefully and without rushing, beginning to let itself be seen. "You should know," she said, "that I'm going to be extraordinarily difficult to manage." "I know," he said. "You say that like it's not a problem." "It's not," he said, and meant it so completely that she felt it settle in her chest exactly the way his laugh had settled there on a Wednesday in December, like a coal dropped from the fire, warm and permanent and impossible to ignore. She turned back to the hall, to the work that was waiting, to the 30 days of meetings and the restructured alliance and the legal processes and the entire enormous, complicated, necessary architecture of a future being built properly this time, on honest ground. Outside the high windows of Blackthorn Hall, Glasgow was gray and cold and indifferent and entirely itself. And Jody Williamson Ashvale, blood heir, bond recognized, seen and named, and standing at full height in the great hall where 6 years of invisibility had finally and irreversibly ended, took a breath, and walked forward into everything that came next. 30 days. That is what it took to restructure the political landscape of 17 territories and one Western clan inheritance. 30 days of meetings and documents and careful, painstaking conversations in rooms that smelled of old stone and wood smoke, and the particular tension of people negotiating the future from positions that had all simultaneously shifted beneath them. 30 days of Jody Williamson Ashvale sitting across tables from territorial lords who had arrived with their defenses assembled and their assumptions intact, and systematically, quietly, without performance or aggression, demonstrating that she understood their concerns with a specificity that unnerved them, because she had been in their halls, carrying their correspondence, learning the geography of their politics for 6 years while they looked past her entirely. It turned out that invisibility, weaponized with intention, was a considerable advantage. Lord Vane came last. His meeting ran 4 hours. He arrived prepared for confrontation and left having agreed to 3 cooperative territorial arrangements that he would not have agreed to under any previous circumstances. He did not apologize for the removal order. She did not ask him to. They understood each other by the end of the 4 hours, with the honest mutual assessment of 2 people who have recognized in each other a particular kind of stubbornness and decided, pragmatically, that alliance is more useful than opposition. It was not warmth. It was the beginning of functional respect, which was, Jody had decided, sufficient. Isolde's restructuring was slower and more complicated. Not the political part, which moved with the clean efficiency of a woman who had spent 14 years mastering every mechanism of Western clan governance and could now apply that mastery without the distortion of a false claim underneath it. The personal part, the aunt and niece part, the 2 women who shared blood and a name and the loss of Moira Williamson and nothing else yet. They were building that from the foundation level, carefully, without rushing it, with the particular patience of people who understand that some things cannot be forced, and that forcing them produces something that looks like the real thing, but isn't. They had tea on the 14th day, in Jody's room, still. Jody had not moved to formal quarters yet, and was not being pressured to, which she appreciated. Isolde sat in the wooden chair, and Jody sat on the bed, and they talked about Moira. For the first time, with both of them present and honest. Isolde told stories Jody had never heard. Moira at 12, fearless and stubborn and determined to climb every structure on the Western clan estate, falling off a turret wall and breaking her wrist and refusing to cry. Moira at 17, writing letters she never sent to a boy from the Northlands. Moira at 22, holding a 2-month-old infant with an expression of such ferocious, absolute love that it had been, Isolde said, the most frightening and most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Jody had listened to all of it, and when Isolde finished, she had taken the photograph from the mirror frame and held it out to her aunt. "Keep it for a week," she said, "then bring it back." Isolde had taken it with both hands. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. And through all 30 days of it, the meetings and the declarations and the slow reconstruction of a political world, there was Callum. He was present the way a constant is present in an equation. Not always visible, not always in the room, but structuring everything around him by virtue of existing. He attended none of her meetings, as agreed. He made no public declarations about the bond beyond the legal minimum required by the proceedings. He did not hover. He did not manage. He did not treat her like something precious and fragile that needed to be protected from the weight of what she was doing. What he did was this. He showed up at the door of her room on the 23rd night with 2 cups of tea and the expression of someone who had noticed that she had not eaten dinner and was not going to make a significant issue of it, but was also not going to pretend he hadn't noticed. She let him in. They sat by the small fire, him in the wooden chair, her on the bed, and she talked through the vein meeting, which was the next morning, and which she was preparing for with the focused energy of someone who does not experience nerves as weakness, but as information. He listened. He asked questions. Good questions, the questions of someone who understood territorial politics at depth, and was deploying that understanding entirely in service of her preparation rather than his own agenda. At one point, she said, in the middle of a sentence about Vane's eastern border concerns, "You already know how this meeting is going to go, don't you?" He said, "I have a strong suspicion." She said, "Tell me." He said, "You're going to let him talk for 40 minutes before you say anything substantive, because you'll have worked out within the first 5 minutes exactly what his real concern is, and you'll spend the next 35 minutes letting him demonstrate it thoroughly enough that when you address it, he can't argue that you've misunderstood him." She looked at him for a moment. "I am watching someone who was deliberately suppressed discover what they're capable of, with access and legitimate authority, and it is—" He stopped, and something in his face did the thing it did, the thing she had seen 3 times now, the thing that was not composure and was not performance, but was simply him. "It is the most compelling thing I have ever witnessed. You do not need to defend your dimensions to me, Jody. I have been trying to be adequate to them since November." She looked at him for a long time. The sky was lightening. Glasgow was beginning its gray, unhurried morning. "Adequate," she said. "It's a process," he said. And there it was, that low, reluctant, surprised out-of-him sound. The laugh. The one she had filed away in December like something too valuable to misplace. She turned back to the river. But she was smiling. Not the contained, careful, survival-grade expression she had operated in for 6 years, but something fuller. Something that took up the space it was entitled to. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The Clyde moved past them, indifferent and continuous, exactly as it had always been. They came back to Blackthorn together in the growing morning light, and the gate guard, a young wolf named Pell who had been one of the first in the building to start nodding when Jody passed in the corridor back in December when nobody could explain why, saw them coming up the road side by side in the gray dawn and stood up straighter in the particular way that wolves stand when something their instincts have been waiting for has finally, visibly, arrived. He opened the gate without a word. She passed through first. Old habit. Then she stopped and turned and waited for Callum to come through. Not because he needed waiting for, but because she wanted to. Because it was a choice rather than a position, and she had decided that this was how she would move through this place from now on. By choice. Every time. The final proceeding was held that afternoon. It was smaller than the Summit Court, not all 30 days' worth of lords and emissaries, just the core witnesses required by law. The great hall, which had held so much of this story in its stones, was quieter than Jody had ever heard it. The fires were lit. The golden lions looked down from their banners. Isolde stood to the left in a deep blue dress. Not crimson, not any longer, but something the color of the winter river outside. She stood straight and composed and present the way she did everything. And when she caught Jody's eye across the room, she gave a brief, private nod that contained within it the compressed weight of everything the previous 30 days had required of her. Jody returned it. Griselda stood at the back of the hall, near the door, in her housekeeper's black with her iron ring of keys at her hip. She had not been invited. She had simply appeared, with the immovable quality of someone who has decided that they are going to be present for a thing and intends to make good on that decision. No one had asked her to leave. The court recorder read the formal declarations. The legal language was dense and ancient and rattled off with the efficient monotony of someone who had been recording documents for 30 years and had learned to apply the same flat professionalism to the momentous and the mundane. When he reached the recognition bond formalization, he paused and looked over his papers at the two people standing in the center of the hall. Formality required verbal confirmation from both parties. The record required their words, spoken in open court, witnessed. He looked at Callum first. Protocol. Callum said, "Confirmed." The recorder looked at Jody. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, not the hesitation of doubt, but the pause of someone who is choosing to be fully present in a moment rather than rushing through it. She looked at the hall, at the stones and the torches and the banners, at Griselda in the back by the door, at Isolde in river blue, at the recorder with his papers, at the court witnesses with their careful, watching faces. Then she looked at Callum, and she found the same thing she had found on the embankment this morning. Not performance, not authority, not the Alpha King's composed public face. Just him. The man who had asked her about Govan and laughed at the rearranged territories and sat in her wooden chair for hours answering questions honestly, and walked to the river in the pre-dawn because he felt the pull and chose to follow it. "Confirmed," she said. The recorder wrote it down. The court exhaled. Afterward, after the papers were signed and the witnesses released and the recorder packed his things and the hall slowly, gradually emptied, Jody stayed. She stood in the center of the great hall alone, or nearly alone. She could hear Callum somewhere behind her, speaking quietly with Brennan. The low voices of men handling the last piece of administrative business that any proceeding generates. She stood and looked at the hall, at the space that had held her invisibility for 6 years, that had been the architecture of her smallness, that she had learned, stone by stone, as a place she was permitted to move through, but never occupy. She occupied it now, fully, without apology. Standing in the center of it, with her feet planted and her chin level, and 6 years of practiced invisibility finally, permanently, laid down. The golden lions looked down from their banners. She looked back. They had been looking down at this hall from those banners for 300 years. They had seen kings and wars and alliances and the complete churning cycles of power changing hands and arrangements dissolving and new ones forming on the ground of old ones. They were not impressed by the particular and the individual. They were the emblem of the enduring, the institutional, the larger than any one person permanence of the thing. But she looked back at them anyway, because she had earned the right to look directly at things that had previously been above her line of sight. And because she was, she had decided, the kind of woman who looks directly at things. Callum came to stand beside her. Brennan had gone. The hall was theirs. He followed her gaze to the banners. Then he looked at her. "Rearranging the territories again?" he said. She turned to him, and the smile came, the full one, the one that took up its rightful space, and she said, "You're welcome." He laughed, the real one, the low, reluctant, surprised out of him sound that she had been keeping safe since December, that she would keep safe for everything that followed, for all the meetings and the politics and the complicated, necessary work of building 2 territories on honest ground, for every morning on the embankment and every late night with tea in the wooden chair, for all of it, for everything that was coming, for the long and complicated and genuine life that was beginning today in the great hall of Blackthorn, where a maid had once walked out with her dignity intact and was now standing at full height in the center of it. He had laughed, and she felt it settle in her chest the way it always had, like a coal dropped from the fire, warm and permanent, and entirely, irrevocably hers. Outside the high windows, Glasgow was gray and cold and continuous, the way it always was. The Clyde moved past the old stones. The city carried on. And inside Blackthorn Hall, in the great hall with the golden lions on the banners and the fires burning amber at both ends, 2 people stood side by side in the light of what they had built. Not on the shifting ground of politics and arrangement and carefully managed distance, but on the only foundation that had ever actually held anything worth keeping. The honest kind. The kind that starts with a woman who doesn't bow and a man who notices. The kind that survives being rejected. The kind that is not diminished by the full size of what it carries. The kind that walks back in. The maid accepted the rejection, but she never accepted being less than what she was. And in the end, in the great hall, on the river, in the small room with the blue cloth on the windowsill, it was the king who had to learn to be large enough to deserve her. Some stories end with a crown. This one ends with a laugh. And that is, without question, the better ending. Jody walked back into that hall and claimed everything they tried to bury. And if her story hit something in you, hit that subscribe button and never miss another tale like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you think Callum deserved her in the end? Like this video if you believe she was always a queen, long before anyone called her one. And tap the video on your screen right now, because the next werewolf story is already waiting. And trust me, you are not ready for what happens in it.